Thanks again for having us, everyone. I am really honored to be here with these three folks who Rebecca introduced. The way we decided we were going to do this short little talk is that we were going to give each of our speakers maybe 3 to 5 minutes, just talk about their own work, and then after they're done, I might ask a few questions, we might have a conversation, and then we will open it up to questions. The one caveat that we talked about during the prep call was that I sort of told these guys to forget that they're talking to a room full of librarians. We almost kind of want to be flies on the walls in certain ways, and listening to them talk about public life, and maybe we can think about how we relate to what they're talking about. But of course, once it's time for you all to ask questions, you can feel free to ask away about what it all means for you and for all of us. So with that, we didn't establish an order, but maybe Shin-pei, or are you first?
Wrong. I think in the slides I'm first.
Matt? Great. All right.
But I do need
You need the, what's that? You do need a clicker, and there is a clicker here. Great.
see if I'm right. There we go.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone. It's exciting to be here. I know you've perhaps heard from some of my colleagues in the past. As our name might suggest, the Center for an Urban Future, we're dedicated to a brighter future for New York. We're here in a lovely city. We just, Richard, our colleague, is also from a wonderful urban system, but as many of you may know, only, I believe, about 65% of the directors have 5 branches or fewer, so we may have very different issues, it would seem, but I'd like to hope that the lessons and findings I have to share with you are still relatable, because I would wager that a lot of our concerns ultimately are the same when it comes to civic spaces. I really like to draw in my hometown hero from Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie, that these spaces, I won't say the L word, but that it is a lot about empowerment. So at the center, our mission is, again, something I think that's fairly relatable. We want to grow New York City's economy by empowering all New Yorkers to thrive within it and give them economic opportunities. And I think that's one of the defining challenges of our time, whether you look at gleaming cities overtaken by cranes, or towns fighting to shake off grit and rust, or even some of the exurbs out there that have maybe grown a little too fast. Equity, equality, opportunity, those have always been the bedrock of the American dream, but some communities are struggling to keep up, but others at the same time are finding new levels of success that maybe they haven't had before. To them, America maybe never was great, and they're just still trying to get there. So looking specifically at New York, a lot of our triumphs and travails are often intertwined. As you can see here, our economy has been on quite the upswing, even in spite of events like 9/11 and the Great Recession. We've reached a record 4.5 million workers, and our population now stands at 8.5 million, up almost 5% in the past 6 years. This good news might seem enviable, but at the same time, a lot of New Yorkers would tell you today that the streets hardly seem lined with gold. For all this success, we have stratospheric rents that also continue to set records. Record homelessness at 61,000 souls. That's nearly 50% higher than just 6 years ago. Subway ridership is booming, but that also has a lot of unintended consequences. You've got 70,000 breakdowns today compared to 28,000 just 5 years ago. One of the things that CUF has really focused on, whether it's libraries or really throughout the city, we've got at least $50 billion in unmet infrastructure needs, and that's just even to get up to a state of good repair, not even build the city of tomorrow, which is what we're really so focused on. So we have all these divides, this so-called tale of two cities, but we often find that it is the civic spaces that a lot of us operate and even work to foster and build, that those are the places where you can bridge these gaps, and we need to continue to find ways of investing in them. Because as you could see, even in a place like New York, we're actually, even with all the diversity, it remains quite a segregated place. One great solution we recently talked about in the New York Times was, you know, going a step further even than just having libraries that are community centers, that you could actually use them as development sites. It's a controversial idea, but that you could incorporate housing and get new libraries out of it, because as many of you may know, unlike some other systems, New York doesn't get the funding it deserves. So we're looking for opportunities for that, not only to provide the important uses of libraries, but also the important needs of housing. So the city remains full of opportunities, but it's also full of contradictions. We've got a record high graduation rate at 76% now, but college success is now our new academic crisis. Only 22% of students in New York City's community colleges are graduating with an associate's degree, and the 4-year graduation rate from the great CUNY schools is only 57%. We have record low unemployment of 4.4%, but rents have risen 3.9%. Since 2010, while wages have only gone up 1.8%. So people are finding jobs, but the question is really the quality of those jobs. And that's really what we're focused on. We don't necessarily have the answers yet. That's what we're working hard to figure out, like a good book. There's no simple passages, and happy endings aren't always guaranteed. As we've already heard, we weren't supposed to talk about the L word, but it's hard not to, because, you know, Cuff's view has always been that one of the greatest places to solve a lot of these issues is within the libraries. So look forward to maybe talking about that later on.
Hi, good afternoon. Again, I'm Jamie Gaudier. I'm the Executive Director of the Fairmount Park Conservancy here in Philadelphia. The Conservancy is a nonprofit that works really closely with the City of Philadelphia, residents, and funders to advance the public park system here. I don't know how familiar you are with Fairmount Park, but it's about 10,000 acres of park once you take into account not only the park proper, but all of the neighborhood parks, of which there are more than 150. And so we work very closely with all of those stakeholders to advance the park system because of the great value that we know that parks bring to people, to neighborhoods, and to our city as a whole. We go about our work in a few ways. So one, we actually do quite a bit of capital projects on behalf of the city. One of our biggest projects right now is called Centennial Commons. It's in the Parkside section of West Philadelphia. It's about an $11 million project that will create really a state-of-the-art park out in Parkside. So something that you'd imagine seeing downtown in terms of the type of play structures and the type of amenities that will be a free amenity to the Parkside community. Beyond park projects, we do conservation and preservation work on historic structures in the park on behalf of the city. Another area of our work is around activation. So we do quite a lot to activate public spaces to make them engaging and fun places for residents. Some quick examples, every summer we operate a 5 to 6 week pop-up park called the Oval down on the Parkway. So it creates a place on the Parkway which is a very sort of car-heavy piece of infrastructure. It creates a place for people to gather and have fun and play games and hear music. And so we do quite a lot of activations all across the city. And then lastly, our last bucket of work is community engagement. And it's also one of our most important pieces of work. So with Parks and Recreation, we operate a park stewardship program. Through that program, we help to start and build the capacity of over 100 volunteer park friends groups in neighborhoods all across the city. Those groups of volunteers are key actors with the city in maintaining parks and keeping an eye on what's going on in parks and keeping parks programmed and in engaging their neighbors in parks. And so we help those groups to connect to resources and small grants. We hold a number of workshops throughout the year. We service a lot of them directly and answer questions for them and help them solve problems within the park, and generally help them to advance and connect to a supportive network. And beyond, you know, we engage with over 100 park groups across the city, but in some areas we go particularly deep within neighborhoods. So for example, with our Parkside project, we actually helped the community to build a CDC because there was no, you know, organization out there really focused on community development in the park. Oh, can you go back? Are you clicking for me? Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. so that's who we are and what we do. I came prepared today to really delve deeply on our community engagement work. One of the areas where we've really been able to focus a lot on community engagement and learn a lot around community engagement is an initiative called Reimagining the Civic Commons. That's a national initiative that was modeled after work that we've been doing with partners here in Philadelphia, and it's been funded by the Knight Foundation and the William Penn Foundation here in Philadelphia. So the idea behind Reimagining the Civic Commons is that if you make investments in public space, you can use that investment as a way of drawing different people into public spaces so that they connect to one another, achieving environmental sustainability, achieving economic development within neighborhoods, and also achieving prosperity for a broad set and diverse set of neighborhood stakeholders. And so here in Philadelphia, Reimagining the Civic Commons is made up by 5 projects. One is our Centennial Commons Park project in West Philadelphia, the other that is led by us, and then there are 4 other projects led by other project partners. So we're working with the Free Library and partners on the Levitt Library and Park in Mount Airy. We're working with the Friends of the Rail Park in Center City District and the Chinatown CDC on a rail park out that spans several neighborhoods. We're working together on Bartram's Mile, and we're working together on also the Discovery Center in East Park. And together, we're not only building public spaces, but we're learning about how to connect residents to those spaces and create ownership. We're learning about what works in terms of activations and programming, and doing that in a way that's really meaningful for residents. And we're learning how to create shared prosperity within neighborhoods. So it's been really meaningful work here in Philadelphia. And then lastly, thank you. Lastly, I wanted to mention that our work with Civic Commons, we've been told and we like to think of it as inspiration for a much bigger investment that's happening now with respect to public spaces, and that's called Rebuild. And so I'm sure that you guys I think you must have talked about that sometime today, but Rebuild will be about $500 million in investment into the renovation of parks, recreation centers, and libraries across the city. There's a universe of about 400 sites that can be redeveloped, and the city thinks that they'll get to between 150 and 200. So we're very excited to see that coming, being that our mission is so focused on parks. In anticipation of Rebuild, we're really focusing even more on community engagement. We think beyond, you know, the groups that we work with, the Park Friends groups, the groups that the library works with, the Library Friends groups, the groups that the recreation centers here work with, the Recreation Advisory Councils. These are all volunteer groups that are key to the city being successful in its capital investment objectives. If these groups can't really work to engage the community and make sure their voices are present, all of this investment will be for naught. So what we've started to focus on is really digging into the assessment of the capacity of the Park Friends groups. We're working with the library to find out what they need to better support the Library Friends groups, and we're working with this in the same way with a group called the Parks Alliance to support recreation advisory councils. And so that's what and that work, and we have money from the Knight Foundation to really invest in the needs of those groups and advance them as Rebuild picks up. So that's our work in a nutshell with community engagement. I hope to talk about it a little more later. Oh, sorry.
I think I meant to pass this thing.
Well, it's really great to be here. I'm Shin-pei, the Executive Director of Gale Institute, and I have to say that the reason I'm personally thrilled to be here is I'm such a product of the public libraries and librarians when I was growing up, so I feel like I'm very thankful and full of gratitude to you and your colleagues, because I wouldn't be the person I am without you. So I want to talk a little bit about our organization and our work, which is squarely on public life. And we see public life as the way that cities can center spaces around people. Our work is on research and advocacy that creates knowledge for systemic change. Public life for us is the social interaction in public spaces, an everyday high-quality public realm. So just imagine when you step out of your house or your apartment building, the kind of experience you have as you walk around maybe to the bus or train or get to the store. That's everyday public realm. And we also see it as civic life, feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Our work is squarely on the intersection of design and physical space and social interaction. So we think design influences behavior, that policy influences design, and this is probably something that you have run into a lot, that even though our cities or our civic institutions might be organized against departments, the public life experience is actually completely seamless. So people do not walk around saying, now I'm in a park space, now I'm in a street space, now I'm in DOT space. It's seamless, and the more that we can reinforce that experience and center people's experience in public space, the more that they will enjoy it and take advantage of it. We think this is a matter of life or death, and for health, actually. This is a study result from meta-analysis that contained data from 34 million individuals in North America, Europe, and Australia that show that loneliness can increase likelihood of mortality by 50%. So the reason to interact with people is, the purpose to do that, the reason to do that for well-being is actually extremely high. And this is a very unscientific chart, but I think people can recognize the general trend. Matt can help me actually find the stats, I'm sure. But in general, I've been working in public spaces for a very long time, nearly 20 years, and public space awareness has really increased. There's greater awareness in public space. Civic institutions get on mayoral platforms now. At the same time, we've just seen inequity grow across all dimensions, and trust and erosion in civic life has really increased as well. Trust has decreased, and erosion in civic life has increased. So this is something that we're really thinking about as we think about our work in public life. And so one of the ways that we work is to try to create ways in for people who are decision makers. So we created this Mayor's Guide to Public Life. I think that you can call it Librarian's Guide to Public Life too, because the actions here are very applicable by design. They're meant to be broadly approachable. And one of the ways, so there are 5 strategies. One of them is to measure, to take stock of what you have, to understand your assets, so that you can tweak if necessary. And this is something that happened in Times Square, where the allocation of street space showed that 90% of space was given to cars, even though 90% of the people passing through were actually walking. So that actually created the political motivation to pedestrianize the space. Something that librarians are very good at, inviting. We think that to foster public life, there's lots of different ways of inviting people to participate and to even go to where they are, rather than expecting them to show up where you are. A lot of times decision makers just hesitate because it seems like it's hard to decide between different ideas, but if you just try and experiment, that's something that helps you understand what is possible and creates a shared experience. In San Francisco, we worked on a project with a practice that involved prototyping, inviting people to try different installations to show how a street could be redesigned. And as the installations continued over time, the input from the data collected from people who showed up informed the ongoing development of the project itself. So you don't have to wait for capital funding 3 years down the line before the public sees something. You can start to tweak the development of your project. And finally, there's a lot of talk lately about, tactical urbanism, experimentation, prototyping, but fundamentally what we're talking about is sustainability in these changes, and so it is important to consider how you formalize and what sort of policy changes are necessary to support it. So I just want to leave you, oh, is this it? Oh, yeah. My final slide was that we can do it. It's not that, it's not left to any single organization or person in a city. It requires the participation of everyone.
Thanks, folks. Shin-pei, maybe I'll start with you. You showed a slide showing this increase in awareness of public life or public space, yet you see these downward trends in terms of equity and trust. So one of the things we wanted to focus on here are just sort of trends in public life. I'm thinking it's been almost probably 20 years since Putnam's Bowling Alone, which was one of the very first tomes about this erosion of, I guess, like social capital. So I think we would all be interested in hearing from somebody who devotes her life to this. What are the trends in public life? And that's what, when we're mulling over, how does this impact our work?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of studies on how social capital, social cohesion, how we make community connections, and we were just talking before this program started about, what does it mean to feel engaged, or when you go out and think about that, what does that look like? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I think, my work looks at it from a spatial orientation. And I have to say that if we're starting from looking at, Putnam's book, at that moment in time, there was really a huge trend towards sprawl and the creation of single-use kinds of developments, a lot of investment in highways and roads that maybe kind of decentralized the kinds of places that once were. And not to say that, suburban places can't have a feeling of being together, but that really actually created a trend towards a decentralization. It became harder and harder for people to have spontaneous interactions. You don't run into people nearly the same way, as much as you might have once done, and so I think that's one major trend that has gone on. Obviously, the lack of public investment in civic institutions is a huge, that's just been a downward trend. The increase in private interest in public institutions is also the other trend, so that means that you are at the whim of private interests. And then finally, I think we're having some really critical conversations. We're recognizing that not everyone, even from 20 years ago, were able to participate in public life. And that for some communities, it remains very challenging to even walk down the street. It's dangerous. They will never feel like they really belong unless we really change the way that certain practices in terms of enforcement are taken care of. And so I think there are all these different convergences that has resulted in that.
Great. Matt, CUF, which is one of my favorite organizations of all time. I think you guys have done so much to elevate libraries in the public consciousness. Talk a little bit about some of the barriers to public life that you guys are seeing from a research perspective. And I know it might be difficult for you, but I'm really sensitive to the fact that so many of us here are also not part of large urban areas, and I wonder if the conversation is the same when we start talking about very small rural parts of the country. I think there's this kind of current political stalemate that exists between urban and rural, and there are different colors and different feelings, so we can maybe sort of broaden our perspective too, but thank you.
Yeah, sure. You know, this isn't entirely, I mean, I mentioned a bit of our research, you know, about one of our big drives. CUF is, I feel, in a lot of ways, I'm new to CUF. I've only been there about 6 months, but even my sense of the organization over the 20 years, you know, we were just talking about that sort of time span, it's evolved a lot. You know, there was a point in time where, like a lot of folks, we were for basically any kind of investment in the city, because the thought that any company would want to come and create jobs in New York, or that you could build a new park, or, you know, I mean, there's always apartment construction going on, but, you know, there was this real worry about the future of New York, you know, and slowly we've clawed our way back to where it's now the opposite end of the spectrum, where our focus really is around equity and making sure, you know, that the job creation is good jobs, you know, and we have to be careful about the pendulum not swinging too far the other way. You know, there's been a lot of conversation lately about Amazon, and there's some people in the city who have said, you know, well, we don't want Amazon. They're just a force for gentrification. They're going to drive up the housing costs. I just saw a stat the other day that 65% of all housing appreciation within Seattle over the past decade they were saying can be attributed to, and it wasn't they, I think it was actually Zillow, you know, looking at census, you know, employment stats and neighborhood rent increases, that 65% of rent growth in Seattle could be attributed to jobs from Seattle and similar sort of spin-off tech firms, sorry, from Amazon. And so we would never say, even if every single of those 50,000 people that came to live and work in New York, you know, were coming from CMU and Stanford, and, you know, I talked about our unfortunate college graduation rates, that, you know, that if we could still bring in 50,000 good-paying jobs, that would be a net positive for New York. But really the ideal to us now is to ensure, you know, that we're improving training programs, that we're improving education, you know, and this is something I think that a lot of folks in this room see themselves as partners in, and ensuring that the local communities can really benefit from this stuff. And then speaking perhaps a little bit to the rural example, I think one thing that is really fascinating is, you know, in 2015 we passed the threshold where more than half of the world population was living in cities. I think within a decade or two it's supposed to be 70%. So we are getting a bit back to this urban life, but the investments aren't there. You know, it is a lot of more private spaces and a lot of well-to-do spaces. You see something like the High Line, which was funded with $150 million from the city and unleashed more than $1 billion in development, but now it's hemmed in by all these luxury towers and it's clogged by tourists, so there can be a lot of unintended consequences. And you know, I think you have people moving to the cities for jobs and opportunities, and that's great, but oftentimes they're leaving behind family, communities they may have grown up with, their beloved libraries, things like that. And on the flip side of things, in a lot of the communities that have been struggling, you know, we are at the lowest rate of job mobility since the 1920s, I think it was the stat that I saw, because, you know, people they're relying, you know, when the jobs have gone away, the factories have gone away, they feel like family is all they have left. And so it's hard to have sort of that pioneering spirit, but at the same time, if you do go off and pioneer, you may be making other sacrifices, I think.
Great, thank you. A minute ago you mentioned that all of us in the room see ourselves as partners in some way, shape, or form in trying to address some of this. Jamie, I wanted you to talk a little bit about partnerships. I think that for us in library land, it's the holy grail. Frankly, I see people who come in and do my work for me better than I could by myself. It feeds into my slothfulness. But can you talk about what you see as really successful partnerships and how two organizations or more can drive something better and stronger than any one individual?
Sure. So partnerships, most of what we do involves some type of partnership, starting with the very way that we're structured. So we're, you know, for all intents and purposes, the nonprofit partner to the city in advancing the park. So we probably talk to Parks and Recreation multiple times a day on various projects. And as an example, with our park stewardship team, that I described earlier, the team that works with the Friends groups, it's actually a team, a cross-organizational team with staff from the Conservancy and staff from Parks and Recreation. And we each share parts of that partnership, right? So we're the nonprofit, so we bring in the funding. We do a lot of the capacity building and setting up the workshops. The city is a landowner, right? They are able to more easily facilitate maintenance and questions related to issues like that, and to kind of mobilize their team to get improvements done on parks. So our very formation involves partnerships all the time. A lot of the work that we're doing now is also based on very strong partnerships. The work that I described just a few minutes ago, we're working with the Free Library and the Parks Alliance to really invest in the community organizations that engage residents in public spaces. We've developed a shared table where we talk about each of the ways that we're working with these community groups, and we share best practices, and we're trying to make joint investments. It sounds like maybe not a revolutionary thing, but it's the first time that it's ever happened. And so we're trying to think of rebuild this huge capital program as something that's not only pulling together the parks and recreation and library system from a capital perspective, but we're trying to think of what that looks like with respect to community engagement and community infrastructure and programming as well, because it involves similar challenges, and there's a lot that we can learn, from one another. And so partnerships is that part of our work involves a lot of partnerships too. Additionally, maintaining the very assets that we're trying to advance out in communities doesn't work if we don't have partnerships with residents. They're the folks who are on the ground every day. They're the eyes on the street as it relates to all of the public assets within neighborhoods. So we've had to develop deep relationships and partnerships with neighborhoods to advance our mission as well.
Awesome. Shin-pei, I love from the mission statement at the GEL, we are committed to getting public life on the agenda of cities across the globe. That is really inspirational. Something I was talking to you about a few minutes ago outside was how do you measure success? What does successful public engagement or public life look like? I think that would certainly help us as we sort of mull this over.
Well, so measure was one of the strategies as well. So in the world of planning and design, and even science, we understand environments for animals, but we're only starting to build our understanding of healthy environments for humans. There's tons more data about vehicles traveling through a city than there are about people enjoying space. And so you have practices and policies that ultimately, in many cases, result in spaces that discourage people from using them, and it's the smallest things. So some of the measurements that we use are extremely basic, and they're common sense, but if you can believe it, they don't happen. They literally are counting people as they walk at the block level as they're walking down a street. If most DOTs do not have this information. If you look at a park, you might think that parks departments frequently are counting and trying to understand what people are doing. And it's true, they have an anecdotal sense of what's happening in a park, but there isn't a methodological understanding of maybe over the 12 hours of a course of a day, over the entire week, in every season, what are people doing? We also get down to a very granular level of what we think are activities that represent public life. And it's non-judgmental. So we are, we like spaces that encourage people to relax. So we want, one of the things we might look at is whether or not people are sleeping. And politically, that is not always popular. But it's contextual, right? Because if it's Central Park in New York City or Hyde Park, people sleeping in the park in the middle of the day, in business suits, it's very common. If it's Civic Center in San Francisco, they are policed out of the Civic Center space. But we think that, these are policy issues. You can't address it unless you have that fundamental understanding of what is happening. We count what people are pushing, carrying, doing, whether or not they're sitting together in groups, talking, not sitting together, not talking. We get pretty granular.
Great, thank you. Matt, Shin-pei just mentioned, there's a policy component here. How do we get this on the radar of, besides the report that the Gale Institute issued, the mayor's guide, how do we elevate this to policy? How do we get our elected officials to take this seriously and help institute some kind of change?
It's a good one. I mean, I think, one big part of it, and maybe I'm biased because before I got to CUF, I was a reporter for 10 years. I mean, I know in our own research, 90% of the work goes into writing it, but it feels oftentimes like 90% of the work goes into pitching it, and like, how can we get this into this or that outlet? I mean, one thing that I think is very promising is social media and kind of the changes that we're seeing around the modes of communication. I mean, obviously they can be used for darker means, but there's no reason to that, you can't drive campaigns around civic engagement and, spreading some of these issues. I know in Jersey City, where we live, there was an effort to build a casino in Liberty State Park, and there was a huge groundswell of support or opposition that may have happened anyway, but a lot of it was generated online, and I think that can be an important vehicle. I mean, part of that too, in terms of counting and things, is technology, has a huge role to play. You hear a ton of talk, and we've been doing some work around automation, but everyone seems to be obsessed with this Internet of Things now and the potential that that has, and it can certainly help, right, with counting people in parks and things if you can get them to opt into systems that, data I think is also super powerful if you can get the right data, but there again, then you have to start to worry about, who's following whom when, and, I mean, I think there's a lot of fascinating, terrifying work going. Like, the future is coming way faster, I think, than any of us appreciate in that realm. And ultimately, I think probably just good old-fashioned, shoe leather campaigning and things like that. I mean, there is a new generation of politicians coming up. There is again, thinking to my own experiences with a lot of the mayors, I mean, there's a huge fight in New York going on around congestion pricing, and a lot of people can't imagine why this progressive mayor wouldn't support it, and it seems like it may just be because the governor supports it, but that's the old kind of fights. But then in Jersey City, there's, we elected a young mayor who sort of threw off the shackles of the old machine for the first time in a generation and has been doing bike lanes and a lot of this stuff. So I think sort of activism, campaigning, those are really important to get people who share your ideas and ideals out there.
Awesome. You guys seem to have something to say, and then we'll open it up to questions. All right.
I think you need people. So sort of the last point you made around activism. As some of you may be aware, Rebuild, the capital initiative I mentioned, was funded by a soda tax here in Philadelphia. It was the third time that the soda tax was attempted, and it was the time that it was attempted successfully. There was a huge and moneyed campaign against pushing this soda tax. What won it was that the administration could point positively to things that the soda tax would fund that people really wanted. One was Rebuild, and the other two initiatives had to do with education. The only reason, I mean, it was so tense here. The soda guys were like circling City Hall with these big trucks, and it was true, really. They're circling City Hall with these big trucks, like honking their horns. But what won was the activists who were for parks and who were for education, they were inside City Hall having read-ins with little kids. That's what won, and that's what's going to get us $500 million invested in our public spaces here. People. So yes, social media is incredibly important, but people who are the ones who access these spaces and interact with them, are the ones who can win from a policy perspective, in terms of what we've seen, at least.
And yeah, just put a point on that, with the people, part of our work is trying to democratize that understanding of public life and data collection for people. And we worked with the City of San Francisco, City of Seattle, and City of Copenhagen to create a protocol and we've published tools so that more and more people, the advocates, can be a part of understanding the space so that they can make an argument for investment decisions. And we've definitely, in the creation of these tools and the protocol, that was precisely what the directors at these cities said they needed. They needed that data point that said, we see 20 people clustered here with nowhere to sit. That's where we're going to invest in making this a better place. And so I think it's definitely people in democratizing and empowering them to do that, I think is really important.
So Matt, Jamie, and Shin-pei, thank you so much for your time. It's been great.